What could turn a 5-year-old prince into someone people wanted gone? This is Mephibosheth, a boy who lost his grandfather, his father, and the use of his own feet, all in one single afternoon. He grew up hiding, crippled, far from the throne he was born into. He believed he was worth nothing. Who am I? Why would you even bother looking at someone as worthless as I am? But what if the thing that made him feel worthless was only the beginning of the story? You'll watch one fall break a boy's legs forever. You'll see a king search for the family of the man who once tried to kill him. You'll watch a broken man get everything he never had, then almost lose it all because of one lie. You'll hear him try to explain the truth with tears in his eyes. Stay until the end, because this story will teach you something big. Being forgotten by the world does not mean you are forgotten by God. If you've ever felt broken, left out, or like no one sees the good in you, this story is for you. Israel had just lost its king. Saul, the first king of Israel, had been killed in battle against the Philistines. 3 of his sons died beside him, including Jonathan. In a single day, the royal family had been torn apart, and the whole kingdom was thrown into confusion. Nobody knew what would happen next, but everyone knew that Israel would soon have a new king. There was one problem. Saul's family was still alive. In those days, when a new king took the throne, it was common for the old king's family to be hunted down and killed. It was a cruel way of making sure no one from the previous king's family could ever return and claim the throne. That meant every surviving member of Saul's family, Mephibosheth included, was now in terrible danger. News of the battle had already reached the royal palace. Fear spread through every room, and everyone realized the same terrifying thing. Staying inside the palace could mean death. His nurse understood exactly what was happening. She knew the little prince's life was now in terrible danger. Without wasting a single moment, she picked Mephibosheth up in her arms and hurried out of the palace. She did not stop to gather clothes, food, or anything else. Her only thought was getting the young boy as far away from the palace as possible before anyone came looking for Saul's family. As she rushed through the chaos, disaster struck. In the middle of her escape, she stumbled. Mephibosheth slipped from her arms and crashed hard onto the ground. The fall badly injured both of his feet. Even so, she could not stop. She quickly picked him up again and kept running until they were finally far away from the palace and out of immediate danger. Only then could she see how badly he had been hurt. There were no hospitals, no surgeons, and no doctors who could repair an injury like that. His nurse cared for him as best she could. Day after day she cleaned his wounds, looked after him, and hoped that with enough time his feet would heal. But they never did. Mephibosheth survived the fall, but he would never walk normally again. From that day forward, he was crippled in both feet. He could no longer run like other children. He could not fight like other men. Even walking from one place to another would often require someone else to help him. In a single afternoon, everything in his life had changed. Just hours earlier, he had been a prince living inside the royal palace, surrounded by servants and protected by the strongest family in Israel. Now, he was a crippled child with no home, no king, and no kingdom. The accident would affect the rest of his life, leaving him dependent on others for many of the simplest things he would ever do. His nurse continued carrying him farther away from the palace until they reached a place where no one would think to look for Saul's grandson. She eventually brought him to a small town called Lo-debar, far from Jerusalem, where a man named Machir welcomed him into his home. Hidden far from the palace, Mephibosheth disappeared from the eyes of the kingdom. Years passed. Israel continued to face trouble as different men fought over who would rule the nation. But none of that fighting reached Mephibosheth. He remained hidden in Lo-debar, growing up far from the palace where he had been born. The little prince slowly became a man. He married, started a family of his own, and lived a quiet life, while the injury to his feet reminded him every day of the afternoon that had changed everything. As the years passed, almost everyone forgot that the grandson of King Saul was still alive. But one man never forgot.
Before we continue, these videos takes hours and hours to make. Please like and subscribe and comment which country you're watching this from. Want to support the channel? Consider sending a super thanks. It truly helps us so much.
David had made a promise long ago, and even now that he sat on the throne himself, that promise had never faded from his mind. Before Jonathan, Saul's son, died, David had promised that if he ever became king, he would always show kindness to Jonathan's family. Now, after all these years, David decided it was finally time to keep that promise. He turned to the men around him and asked, "Is there anyone still left from Saul's family?" David remembered a promise. David immediately called Ziba back into the room. Ziba had once been a servant in King Saul's household, so he knew exactly which land had belonged to Saul's family. David gave him a new command. Everything that had once belonged to Saul and his family would now belong to Mephibosheth. But David did not stop there. He also told Ziba, along with his 15 sons and 20 servants, to work that land for Mephibosheth. They would plant the crops, gather the harvest, and make sure Mephibosheth and his family always had enough food to live on. Mephibosheth himself would not have to work the fields or worry about providing for himself. Instead, David gave him an even greater honor. From that day forward, Mephibosheth would always eat at the king's own table. That meant far more than simply being invited to share a meal with David. Mephibosheth would now be treated like one of the king's own sons. Every day, he would sit at the same table as David and his family. He would eat the same food, receive the same care, and be shown the same respect as everyone else in the palace. A man who had spent years hiding in the small town of Lo-debar was now living inside the royal city. Ziba accepted the king's command, and from that day on, he and his family worked the land that belonged to Mephibosheth, bringing him everything it produced. Meanwhile, Mephibosheth left Lo-debar behind and moved to Jerusalem. The same city he had escaped from as a frightened little boy had now become his home once again. For the first time in many years, Mephibosheth no longer had to live in fear. Mephibosheth even had a young son named Micah, and together they were able to begin a new life. Every day, Mephibosheth sat at the king's table alongside David's own sons. Nobody looked down on him because he could not walk properly. The servants treated him with the same kindness and respect they showed the rest of the royal family. Many peaceful years passed before another tragedy struck Israel. A famine spread across the land and lasted for 3 long years, with no rain and no explanation for why the ground had turned against them. David prayed and asked the Lord why the famine would not end. God revealed that it was because of something King Saul had done many years earlier. To make things right, 7 of Saul's descendants would have to die. Mephibosheth belonged to Saul's family, so by human thinking, he should have been included. But David remembered the promise he had made to Jonathan and refused to hand him over. While other descendants of Saul lost their lives, Mephibosheth was spared once again because David remained faithful to his word. After that, many more peaceful years passed. Mephibosheth continued living in Jerusalem, eating at the king's table just as David had promised. After everything he had been through as a child, It must have seemed as though the hardest part of his life was finally over. But another storm was already beginning to grow. And this time, the danger would not come from Saul's family. It would come from David's own son. David's son, Absalom, slowly began turning the people against his father. Day after day, he stood at the city gate, welcoming anyone who came with a problem. He listened to their complaints, spoke kindly to them, and told them that if he were king, he would treat them much better than David ever had. Little by little, more people began trusting Absalom instead of David. After several years, Absalom believed he had enough supporters. He declared himself king, and before long, thousands of Israelites had joined his side. The rebellion spread so quickly that David realized staying in Jerusalem would only lead to a bloody battle inside the city. Rather than let innocent people die, David gathered his family, his servants, and everyone who remained loyal to him. And together, they fled from Jerusalem. Mephibosheth wanted to leave with the king. He called for Ziba, the servant who looked after his land, and told him to saddle a donkey so he could ride with David. Mephibosheth waited, expecting Ziba to return at any moment, but the donkey never came. Ziba disappeared without saying a word, and before Mephibosheth understood what had happened, David and everyone traveling with him had already left Jerusalem. Unable to follow on his own, Mephibosheth was left behind in the city, completely helpless. As David traveled away from Jerusalem, Ziba caught up with him. He brought donkeys loaded with bread, raisins, fruit, and wine for the king and the people traveling with him. David thanked him for the supplies, but he quickly noticed that Mephibosheth was nowhere to be seen. He immediately asked where he was. Ziba answered without hesitation. He claimed that Mephibosheth had stayed behind because he believed the kingdom would now return to Saul's family. It was a shocking accusation. According to Ziba, the man David had welcomed into his own home had chosen to betray him at the very moment David needed his friends the most. David had no way of knowing whether the story was true. He was fleeing for his life, far from Jerusalem, and there was no time to investigate. Believing Ziba's words, David immediately gave him everything that belonged to Mephibosheth, including all the land David had once restored to him. Meanwhile, Mephibosheth knew nothing about what had happened. He was still waiting in Jerusalem. Weeks later, Absalom's rebellion came to an end when he was killed in battle, and David finally began returning to Jerusalem as king once again. People came out from every direction to welcome him home. Among them was Mephibosheth, who had not trimmed his beard, washed his clothes, or properly cared for himself from the day David left until the day he returned. Even before he spoke a single word, it was clear he had not spent those weeks celebrating David's troubles. He had spent them mourning the king's absence. When David saw Mephibosheth, he immediately noticed something was different. He did not look like a man who had been celebrating a new king. He looked like someone who had been mourning. Before David even asked a question, it was clear that something was not right. The king looked at him and asked, "Mephibosheth, why didn't you come with me?" Mephibosheth finally had the chance to explain what had really happened. He told David that because he was crippled, he could not travel on his own. He had asked Ziba to saddle a donkey for him so he could ride out of Jerusalem with the king. But instead of helping him, Ziba had left without him. Then he had gone to David and told lies about him. Mephibosheth reminded David that he had nowhere else to turn. He could not chase after the king on foot, and he could not defend himself while David was gone. Then, instead of demanding justice, he humbly placed the whole matter into David's hands. "My lord, the king is like an angel of God," he said. "Do whatever seems best to you. My whole family deserved nothing but death from you, yet you welcomed me to eat at your own table. I have no right to ask for anything more." David listened carefully. He knew only two men truly knew what had happened, and each one was telling a different story. There was no easy way to prove who was telling the truth, and no time to search for more evidence than the words already in front of him. After thinking about it, David made his decision. He ordered that the land should be divided between Ziba and Mephibosheth. It was a simple judgment that ended the argument, even if it did not answer every question. Mephibosheth accepted the king's decision without arguing. Then he said something that showed what had truly been in his heart all along. "Let Ziba keep it all," he replied. "My lord the king has returned home safely, and that is enough for me."
Want to support the channel? Consider sending a super thanks. It truly helps us so much.